The Queens of England. Of the 66 monarchs who have ruled over England since the Norman conquest, only 8 have been queens. These women have had to fight to gain and hold power. Through most of English history, men outranked women in the line of succession, so the only way for a woman to inherit the throne was if she had no living brothers. The wives of kings, while called queens, are not monarchs in their own right and are referred to as queen consorts. Some of the female monarchs who were fortunate enough to occupy the throne were less than brilliant rulers, but some reigned with wisdom and justice, proving a woman could do the job just as well as a man. Here are their stories. Matilda. As a princess, Matilda was seen as a marriage pawn. At the age of 8, she was sent to Germany to live at the court of her betrothed, the Holy Roman Emperor. At 11, she married the 27-year-old Emperor Henry V. As empress, she was very successful and popular, frequently serving as regent while her husband was away at war. Henry died of cancer 11 years later, and the 22-year-old empress had an unclear future. As she and the emperor hadn't had any children, she had no right to remain at the German court. She could either become a nun or remarry. She chose the latter and accepted a proposal from Geoffrey V, Count of Anjou. Back in England, Matilda had a younger brother, William, who was expected to be king. At 17, he held a raucous party on board the White Ship. The passengers and crew were all drunk and the ship crashed into the rocks. Everyone on board drowned. Their cries could be heard on land all night, but no one could save them in the dark. This left Matilda the only living child of King Henry I of England. The king tried to make his nobles swear loyalty to his daughter, but they were reluctant as they didn't believe a woman could rule. When the king died, Matilda was in Anjou, and before she could make it back home, her cousin, Stephen of Blois, seized the throne. He had the support of some of the barons who recognized that he was weak and would do nothing to stop them doing as they pleased. Matilda gathered support to press her claim, and England was divided between the two. Stephen's followers turned against him when he confiscated lands and emptied the treasury in an attempt to bolster support. Matilda's army captured Stephen, and Matilda was crowned as the first Queen of England in her own right. However, she was used to politics in Germany, where the emperor's every word was law. But in England, things were different. When the barons of England demanded that she swear a coronation oath limiting her power and giving power to them, she was baffled and refused. Her imperious attitude was intolerable to the English, so they tossed her out and had her cousin Stephen back as their king. Matilda remained in England for several years, plotting to regain her throne, and passed the torch on to her son, Henry, who continued to war with Stephen. When Stephen's own son Eustace died suddenly, Stephen made Henry his adopted son and heir, and died shortly thereafter, making Matilda the mother of a new dynasty that would dominate England in the Middle Ages, the House of Plantagenet. Jane. Henry VIII's longed-for son, Edward VI, had only been on the throne for 6 years when it became clear that the sickly young man would die. With no sons or brothers to inherit, the next in line was his older sister Mary, who was a staunch Catholic. Edward was just as fervently Protestant and balked at the thought of his sister returning England to the Vatican. So he devised to skip both his sisters on the grounds of illegitimacy and make his cousin queen instead. Jane was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary, the Queen of France. Upon hearing that she would be queen, she fainted. Jane had an outstanding humanist education and was a dedicated Protestant. She may have been an excellent queen, but the scheme to swap out Jane for Mary was doomed from the start. Mary was popular with the people, and they felt they had been duped. Mary easily raised an army and marched to London, ending Jane's reign after only 9 days. The men who had put Jane in this dangerous position saw the writing on the wall and abandoned her to save their own skins. Her own father arrested her. Jane and her husband Dudley were imprisoned in the Tower of London. Mary, now queen, recognized that Jane had been a political pawn and did not wish to execute her cousin. But when a rebellion in Jane's favor frightened Mary's betrothed from coming to England, Mary signed the death warrant, and the 16-year-old, 9 days queen lost her head. Mary I. Henry VIII's eldest child, Mary, had had to fight her whole life for her position after her mother, Catherine of Aragon, had been cast out as queen. When Mary came to the throne at 37, she made quick work of undoing her father and brother's efforts to convert the nation to Protestantism. She was a devout Catholic and became known as Bloody Mary by burning some 280 Protestants at the stake in her short 5-year reign. She married her cousin, Philip II, King of Spain, and loved him dearly, but her affections were not returned. She was desperate for an heir to keep the throne from her Protestant younger sister Elizabeth, but with her husband frequently away in his own kingdom, this proved challenging. At last, Mary began to exhibit symptoms of pregnancy, but as the 10th and 11th months ticked by with no signs of labor, her swollen belly began to recede. She probably suffered a combination of a tumor and a psychosomatic episode. Following the humiliation of her false pregnancy, Philip returned to war on the continent, and Mary was heartbroken. She died at the age of 42, most likely of uterine cancer. Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, had spent her half-sister Mary's reign desperately avoiding any association with plots against the Queen. Even so, Mary was always deeply suspicious of her Protestant younger sister and had her in and out of imprisonment and always close to the chopping block. When Mary died, Elizabeth was declared queen at the age of 25. She was incredibly intelligent, an outstanding leader, and is considered one of the greatest monarchs in English history. She was more politically moderate than her father and siblings had been and promoted religious tolerance. In response, the Pope declared that any Catholic who killed the English queen would be innocent of sin. The many assassination attempts that ensued were all foiled by her secret service. As her mother had been beheaded on her father's order, it is no surprise that Elizabeth refused to marry and became known as the Virgin Queen. She did, however, have many favorites throughout her life. She was particularly close to Robert Dudley, whose wife died in a fall down the stairs that may have been orchestrated by Dudley to free him up in case the Queen proposed marriage. She didn't, however, and rebuffed her many foreign suitors as well, including her sister's widower, Philip II of Spain, who, in his disappointment, brought the Spanish Armada to overthrow Elizabeth. Against great odds, she led the country to one of the greatest military victories in its history and defeated Philip's fleet. Elizabeth dressed fabulously and wore elaborate red wigs and fine, poisonous lead makeup. She was idealized in art and encouraged her people to worship her as a demigod. During her reign, the wool trade flourished and the English became wealthier than ever. She was loved by most, but still had one enemy. Her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, was the center of many Catholic plots to overthrow Elizabeth. Mary was not the queen Elizabeth was. She had married a foolish and violent man, Henry Darnley, who in a jealous rage murdered Mary's friend and secretary in front of her while Mary was pregnant. Another Scottish lord, James Bothwell, orchestrated Darnley's death by blowing up his bedroom. Mary then married Bothwell, and everyone suspected that she'd been involved in her first husband's murder. She was forced to flee to England, where she was immediately arrested. Elizabeth put off executing Mary for years. She had a horror of killing her cousin and a fellow monarch. But when Mary was found to have participated in a plot to have Elizabeth assassinated, Elizabeth signed the death warrant and Mary lost her head. Queen Elizabeth's 44-year reign was known as the Elizabethan era and was a time of stability and prosperity. It was a period of flourishing arts, led by the likes of Shakespeare, who wrote such timeless plays as Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, and Macbeth. Exploration and colonization of the Americas was led by the legally sanctioned pirate Francis Drake, and by Walter Raleigh, who named Virginia after his beloved queen. Elizabeth died at 67, ending a golden era in England. Mary II. after a century of squabble over the throne between Protestants and Catholics. The Protestant majority was saddled with a dreaded Catholic king, James II. Parliament wouldn't stand for it, so they invited the Protestant William and Mary to peacefully invade the country and depose James. William was the Prince of Orange and ruled the Dutch. His wife and cousin, Mary, as the daughter of the deposed King James II, had a better claim on the throne, but she insisted that her husband be her co-ruler. This suited William fine, as he was not a man to play second fiddle to his wife. Because they were ruling at Parliament's invitation, Parliament finally got to call the shots. No standing army, no raising taxes, no going to war without Parliament's permission, and Parliament got to decide who was monarch. It was called the Glorious Revolution because royal power was redefined, free of bloodshed. King James made a bid to regain the crown from his daughter and son-in-law by raising Catholic troops in Ireland, but his forces were defeated at the Battle of the Boyne. William was more interested in his lands in the Netherlands and spent much of his time there, so Mary did most of the ruling in England. She promoted religious tolerance but otherwise understood her new royal position and stayed out of politics, primarily functioning as a ceremonial figurehead. 5 years into their joint reign, Mary died of smallpox at the age of 32. William deeply mourned his wife's passing, but the pair hadn't had any children, possibly because William favored the company of young men. The couple's heir was Mary's younger sister, Queen Anne. Anne. Like her sister, Anne was married to a Protestant prince, George of Denmark. He was an indolent alcoholic, and she had no interest in sharing power with him. Anne was the first married queen to rule on her own. She reveled in the ceremony and majesty of monarchy. In 1707, Parliament passed the Acts of Union, which finally made England and Scotland a single sovereign state called Great Britain. All monarchs from this point on would be known as British rather than English. A combination of the two countries' flags, called the Union Jack, became widely used. As several kings before her had male favorites, Anne had female favorites. The most significant was Sarah Churchill, ancestor of the World War II Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Sarah's husband was a top military commander, and Sarah's close relationship with the Queen made her the second most powerful woman in the country. Sarah was beautiful and charming, while Anne was plain, sickly, and shy. Sarah often used her influence to her advantage and wasn't afraid to disagree with the Queen. The couple were politically opposed. Sarah supported the progressive Whigs and Queen Anne the religious and conservative Tories. Anne grew tired of Sarah's political lectures and attempts to influence policy, particularly in prolonging the war on the continent led by Sarah's husband. Eventually, Anne transferred her affections to another lady-in-waiting, Abigail Marsham, who was young and demure, quite the opposite of Sarah. In the midst of this new relationship, Anne banished her first love from court. Queen Anne must have spent some time with her husband because she had 17 pregnancies. Tragically, most ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. It is believed by medical historians that Anne's numerous pregnancy losses were due to her having Hughes syndrome, which causes the blood to be sticky and thick. This would explain many of Anne's health problems, which confined her to a wheelchair later in life. Sticky blood has a hard time traveling through the veins of an adult, but it is near impossible for it to travel through the tiny veins of a fetus. A now commonplace medication, aspirin, would have thinned Anne's blood and saved her baby's lives. Anne's one great hope, her son, Prince William, died at the age of 11 of smallpox. With no clear heir to take the throne after Anne, it was important that Parliament decide who the next monarch would be. So they passed the Acts of Settlement, which laid down the rules by which the British line of succession is still decided today. The rules were, no Catholic will ever again sit on the throne. Only legitimate children are eligible. Spouses of the monarch are not eligible, and male primogeniture, or sons would outrank daughters in the succession. That last rule was struck in 2013, but we'll get to that later. Anne's closest Protestant relative was Sophia of Hanover, who, despite being in her 80s, was determined to outlive the sickly 49-year-old Anne and take the throne. She almost succeeded, but a letter from Anne accusing her of plotting to take the throne so shocked her that she died 2 months before Anne. The crown went to Sophia's son, George, and a new German dynasty stepped onto the British stage. Victoria. Victoria was the only living child of her generation and was incredibly precious to the royal family. Her father died when she was a year old. She was raised by her controlling mother, who saw her only child as a meal ticket. The future queen was kept isolated from other children. She had to sleep in her mother's room until she was 18 and wasn't allowed to go up or down stairs without holding someone's hand, lest she fall and hurt herself. Her mother's secretary, John Conroy, tried to control her. He bullied Victoria to sign papers guaranteeing himself power when she came to the throne, but teenage Victoria was strong-willed and refused. Her uncle, King William IV, managed to live just past her 18th birthday so that she could take the throne without her mother pushing in as regent. Once Victoria was queen, she sent her mother away and basked in her newfound freedom. The Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, was her mentor, and she appointed the wives and daughters of his friends as her ladies-in-waiting. When an election ousted Melbourne in favor of Robert Peel, the new PM wanted some of the ladies-in-waiting to be replaced with his own supporters' women. Victoria refused, and Peel resigned in protest. This was a big no-no. Monarchs were no longer allowed to take sides in politics, and those who did sometimes lost their head. The French Revolution was still in living memory after all. Victoria fell in love with her handsome German cousin, Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The queen had to propose to him, as it would have been improper for a man to ask for a monarch's hand in marriage. At the wedding, she began the tradition of brides wearing white. Before this, women wore their best dress, whatever the color. Albert also introduced the Christmas tree, a German tradition, to Britain. Victoria was quite pleased with Albert in the bedroom as well, and the couple had 9 children. But what should Albert be called? Mary I had been happy to hand over power to her husband, the King of Spain, and that had been a disaster. Elizabeth I refused to marry rather than share the crown. Mary II's husband had been a co-ruling king, and Anne had kept her husband as far away from the throne as possible. Victoria loved and trusted Albert, and she might have let him be King Albert I, but the people didn't trust a foreign prince and wouldn't stand for it. It was decided that Albert would be named Prince Consort, the title held by the current queen's husband, Prince Philip. Not able to be king, Albert needed something to do. He had a good head for finance and did an excellent job reforming the royal pocketbook. He discovered numerous insufficiencies in the way the palace was run and dozens of people on staff who were paid for doing unnecessary jobs, such as setting a banquet table every night for King George, who had long been dead. Albert got Victoria in the black and secured the wealth of future generations of British royals. He also put his talents into arranging the Great Exhibition, which showcased new inventions such as the telegraph and photography, as well as cultural displays from around the world. The exhibition was held in the Crystal Palace, specially built for the occasion. Albert threw himself into everything he did, so much so that he wore himself down, and after an argument with their eldest son, Albert contracted typhoid fever and died at the age of 42. Victoria was heartbroken and spent the rest of her life in mourning, popularizing many mourning practices including wearing black. She spent much of her time at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, where her closeness to a servant named John Brown earned her the nickname Mrs. Brown. She retreated from public life, leading many to wonder why their tax money was going to pay for a queen who didn't work for them. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. The world had changed, and many believed there was no place for a monarchy. One Republican hung a "For Rent" sign on the gates of Buckingham Palace. But the government saw the use of the monarchy. The pageantry inspired the people to patriotism, And Victoria's 9 children made useful political marriages, spreading British influence all over Europe. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli coaxed the Queen out of her hiding with a grand ceremony crowning her Empress of India. While Victoria had been hiding, her armies had been busy conquering and colonizing a quarter of the planet and creating the largest empire the world had ever seen. It was said that the sun never set on the British Empire, and Disraeli wanted the millions of subjects around the world to see themselves not under a conquering army and a bunch of bureaucrats, but under a matronly and regal queen. Victoria became the logo of the empire, and her likeness was seen everywhere. She celebrated a 50-year gold and a 60-year diamond jubilee with parades and celebrations. By the end of her life, Victoria had 90 living descendants, many of whom carried her genes for porphyria and hemophilia, the disease that would cause the downfall of the Russian royal family in 1917. Victoria broke the record with her 64-year reign and set the pattern for British royals to be the focus of ceremony and emblems of their people, but not involved in politics. Elizabeth II. Elizabeth was never meant to be queen, but when her uncle Edward VIII abdicated amid scandal in order to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson, Elizabeth's father became King George VI. The royal family were very popular during World War II. They refused to abandon London even when Buckingham Palace was bombed. The young Princess Elizabeth had served as a truck driver and mechanic in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. Elizabeth was in Africa on a tour of the Commonwealth when her father passed away suddenly, and she unexpectedly became queen. She was 25, the same age that her namesake had taken the crown. Her youth and glamour were an emblem of hope and a source of escapism for Britain still recovering from the devastation of World War II. Her coronation was the first to be televised and spurred thousands to buy their first TV. By her side was her handsome husband, Prince Philip. Philip was a member of the Greek and Danish royal family, but had become a British citizen upon his engagement to Elizabeth. The two had been introduced by Philip's uncle, Louis Mountbatten, and when they fell in love, Louis was thrilled that future generations of the British monarchy would be named Mountbatten, but it was decided that no, the name of the royal house would continue to be Windsor. Elizabeth famously bought her wedding dress with war ration coupons. In fact, she is very frugal. Despite her estimated worth of £500 million, estates, and jewelry, she insists on eating leftovers and having worn-out clothes repaired rather than replaced. Elizabeth and Philip had 4 children: Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward. The eldest, Charles, was invested as heir to the throne and the Prince of Wales in 1969. In the early 70s, Charles fell in love with a vivacious young woman named Camilla. The pair dated for several years, but it became clear that the royal family would not accept a marriage between the couple. Camilla was not a virgin, and she wasn't from the right sort of family. Seeing the situation as hopeless, Camilla accepted a marriage proposal from another man, but she and the prince couldn't keep away from each other. They continued an on-off relationship even as Charles married the woman hand-picked for him, Diana Spencer. Diana was demure and beautiful, seen as a fairy tale princess, but the public didn't see the unhappiness in her marriage until later. On their honeymoon, Charles was more interested in reading than in his new bride. He tried to stay away from Camilla at first, but they rekindled their affair, and the Queen had very little sympathy for her lonely daughter-in-law. Diana became incredibly popular with the people, both for her glamour and for her charity work, particularly with victims of AIDS and landmines. She was known as the People's Princess and the Princess of Hearts. So in 1992, when Diana and Charles split and the unhappiness of their marriage was exposed, Charles and Camilla got the blame. That same year, 2 of the Queen's other children were divorced, Anne from Mark Phillips and Andrew from Sarah Ferguson. The Queen called 1992 her annus horribilis, or horrible year, because on top of all the drama with her children, her favorite home and namesake, Windsor Castle, caught fire and was partially destroyed. When it was announced that taxpayers would foot the repair bill, the people were outraged. The queen was already exempt from paying taxes on her massive fortune, and on top of that, she received millions of pounds a year from the government. Many didn't and still don't see the sense of public funds going to a monarchy, the symbol of an outdated system. The queen finally conceded that she would pay income tax and pay allowances to minor royals from her own pocket. In 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris, and the outpouring of grief around the world was enormous, but was met with silence from the Queen. Charles reacted immediately with sadness at the loss of the mother of his children, but the Queen remained hidden for over a week. The people saw this as cold-hearted and out of touch. Prime Minister Tony Blair finally convinced her that she needed to make a statement. Queen Elizabeth's reign has seen the British Empire come into the modern era, and that includes the loss of most of its territories, now part of the Commonwealth or entirely independent nations. She has become the face of Britain around the world, and not just on stamps. With the jet age, she's been able to go to dozens of countries in person on state visits. As always, the monarchy has teetered between popularity and ridicule. Charles, who will be the next king assuming he outlives his mother, finally married his lifelong love, Camilla. At least they're happy because public sentiment is mixed. Charles and Diana's eldest son and probable future King William married a commoner, Kate Middleton. His younger brother, Prince Harry, married African-American actress Meghan Markle, propelling the royal family further into modernity. The two couples' glamorous weddings and adorable children have gone a long way to win back the hearts of the people. In 2013, just in time for the birth of Will and Kate's first child, a new Succession to the Crown Act was passed, giving daughters equal importance to sons in the line of succession. So in future, the ratio of queens to kings will be closer to 50-50. In 2015, Elizabeth surpassed her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, and now holds the record for the longest reigning monarch in English history. It remains to be seen what lies in store for the future of the British monarchy. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon and help me make more fascinating videos. Patrons get cool perks like exclusive content, mentions in videos, and can even request video topics. A link to my Patreon is in the description. Thank you for watching.